let's get in Hemindra Hazari. Remember, when the private banks came out with numbers and good ones at that, he was the first one to say that there might be, it might be advisable to err on the side of caution. He joins us right now to speak about the space at large, maybe even a couple of earnings. Hemindra, really good having you. I'm glad I have you today. Now, my question is twofold before we talk about the earnings of Bob and PNB. In two scenarios that will unfold tomorrow, it could either possibly be an NDA majority government, which will be a stable government. How do you expect banking to perform, considering that while the fundamentals may be weak, a lot of people are talking about money coming in droves for the equity markets at large and for banking in particular? Do you think the rush of liquidity will kind of lay at bay all the concerns that people like you or people in general may have on the PSU banking space?
You see, the view is that supposing we get an NDA, led decisive with a majority government, the question is, will they majorly recapitalize the public sector banks? Because, capital is what is urgently required, both from a purpose of funding, fresh lending, which will provide some incentive and stimulus to the Indian economy, and second, for the large NPAs which are building up in the system. And wherein, when you have large NPAs, the typical response on the banking sector is not to give out credit, which even slows down the economy even further. So if that are the policy measures that the Indian government under the new leadership is going to take, it would be a major positive for government banks. And that is why you see one of the reasons that the government bank shares have done extremely well. Added to that, you had the Dr. P.J. Nayak committee report, which really effectively talks about, privatizing the PSU banks, which again is a very major positive from the capital market perspective. So I think these are all the undercurrents which are taking place, which have driven PSU bank shares up, despite the kind of weakening numbers that we are seeing, which was to be expected given the current economic environment.
So what's the view here on? Because I hear a lot of skeptics who say that the skeletons in the cupboard still remain. Now, will that play a factor, or do you think that the sentiment uplift plus money coming into the system or money coming in from FIIs will help these stocks going ahead as well? Because they are certainly not cheap as they were maybe 3 or 4 months ago.
See, definitely they are not cheap. Now, the thing is, the main question which the market seems to be answering is that an NDA-led government will revive the capital investment cycle in the economy, which will turn around the economy. Now, mind you, the Indian economy is really stuck with, considerable demand slowdown, which is the main issue, and inflation to me is a secondary issue, but the market makes it out to be as if that is the main issue. Now, I believe I'm a little doubtful whether a new government and a new leadership can implement measures which can turn around a demand slowdown in an environment of weak global growth. Now, if global growth was picking up and there was a definite view about that, then I would be, of more confidence. Second is that another way you can revive your domestic economy is for the government to spend more. Now, if the new government which does come in, starts increasing expenditure, say, for infrastructure projects, for road projects, then that could be a stimulus to the Indian economy. However, the capital markets globally do not permit governments to increase their fiscal deficit. So therefore, I am more cautious that even if we get an NDA-led government, the economic revival would take quite some time to come, if at all it does. But in the initial reaction, obviously you will have, a lot of optimism and euphoria, which will drive up share prices in general.
Hemindra, how do you, look at the historical performance of PSU banks? I mean, how do you compare them right now versus the 5-year historical average? Do you think these stocks have run ahead of time?
Definitely on the fundamentals, I think, all bank stocks have run ahead of their time, even private sector banks, because the underlying fundamentals, I think everyone agrees, has really not improved. In fact, they may have gone even worse. So, but really it is the call that the market is taking going ahead. As of this moment on the ground level, there is no improvement at all happening really. So if you believe, as the market does, that the new government will revive the capex cycle, then, everything will, be turned around instantaneously, and therefore one should buy into these stocks, which is what is currently happening.
Yesterday we had Mr. UR Bhatt on the channel, and I was discussing the whole value gap between private banks and PSU banks with him. And he was of the opinion that, if you remove the bad assets from the book value of PSU banks, and they are not perhaps that cheap. So in that sense, it's a bit of a mirage really from a value perspective, because that's been spoken about quite a bit as an argument that they're fairly cheap banks compared to private banks which have run ahead of themselves. Do you concur with that view, or do you believe that, just because there's going to be a new government, they're going to be pushing on reforms, they're going to be perhaps pushing on, cleaning up asset quality, also the fact that a lot of these banks have already started selling their restructured assets to ARCs, that it could perhaps be a game changer for PSU banks?
See, firstly, I don't believe on the corporate book side there's anything to differentiate between a new private sector bank and a government bank. For me, the government banks are mirroring the economic reality. I really do not see the new private sector banks mirroring the economic reality, because if you see their profits continue to grow, their NPA accretion is not very significant. So for me, that has always been a puzzle, and that is why I had cautioned investors earlier that, at some point there's going to be a slowdown in even new private sector banks' earnings, and, that is what we are seeing in the fourth quarter. So to me, I think the asset quality on the corporate book side should be very similar between a PSU bank and a new private sector bank. Unfortunately, the valuations do not mirror that.
Okay. So, Hemindra, my simple question is, clients coming to you right now and asking you for advice, what would you advise them? Because there is a technical factor at play and there is a fundamental factor at play.
Exactly. So my advice to them is to be cautious, because the current market euphoria is that, leadership, if it is decisive, can turn around a demand slowdown. Now I find that very difficult to believe, because on one hand you have the RBI under a governor who is very particular about inflation and keeping interest rates high. Now in such an environment also it adds, complications, because if you are trying to revive demand in the Indian economy and the RBI governor or the central bank decides to keep interest rates high, then you're really working at cross purposes. So, there has to be some alignment. And I do not believe in the school of thought that you require inflation to be down to incentivize the industry to invest in capacity. I think they're working, if this happens, they'll be working at cross purposes, and it will, compound the problem. And I believe it's already compounding the problem that in an economic slowdown, if the central bank keeps interest rates high to combat cost push inflation, it really does not serve its purpose at all.
Yeah. Hemindra, technical question. Again, with an assumption that there is an NDA majority, do you think it makes sense to have a trading position, if at all, in stocks like ICICI, where there is headroom for FI buying still left, or you would not quite play that?
You see, from a trading perspective, the view in the market currently is of euphoria. The market is not willing to consider any negative news. So if we have an NDA majority government tomorrow, then obviously from a trading point of view, a lot of these stocks would go up. That's why I'm saying from a trading point of view, it makes sense. But from a slightly medium to longer term perspective, I do not see how any decisive government can, turn around a slowdown in an economy without really increasing government expenditure.
Hemindra, thanks very much for joining us.